If you can't sleep, let history be your lullaby tonight.
Hey guys, welcome back to another one of those wonderfully long, unnecessarily detailed, and possibly snooze-inducing bedtime stories. Tonight, we're going medieval. That's right, we're going to talk about food. Not spicy food, not gourmet food, just the extremely boring but oddly comforting world of medieval food collection. So, dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and settle in, because tonight's historical lullaby is about how people hundreds of years ago spent their days picking grain, milking cows, and trying very hard not to starve during winter. Riveting stuff, I know. Now, when you think medieval times, you might picture knights in shining armor, kings in castles, maybe a joust or two. But honestly, for 90% of the population, life was less Game of Thrones and more game of who's bringing in the turnips today. Yeah. The reality is that medieval Europe was basically a very slow, very muddy reality show about survival. And food collection, that was the big event. Let's start with the basics, grain, because bread was life. Forget kale salads, protein shakes, or oat milk lattes. Medieval peasants were powered by bread. The entire system of agriculture revolved around wheat, rye, barley, and oats. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. Sort of. So picture this. It's harvest season. The peasants are out in the fields wearing itchy wool clothes, swinging little curved sickles that could probably take off a finger if you sneezed at the wrong time. The goal? Cut as much wheat as possible before the weather inevitably ruins everything. And yes, the weather always ruined something. Too much rain, moldy crops. Too dry, dust and sadness. Now, here's the fun part. And by fun, I mean slow and backbreaking. After cutting the wheat, they had to bundle it into sheaves. Then those sheaves were tied up with more straw because rope was way too fancy for peasants. And then came threshing. Imagine spending your evenings beating grain with a wooden stick called a flail, trying to separate kernels from stalks. Very exciting, right? You basically just hit things until the food fell out. And after threshing came winnowing. This is where you toss the grain up in the air so the wind blows away the chaff. It sounds kind of whimsical, like a rustic Instagram reel. But trust me, after 6 hours of it, it was more, I'm breathing straw dust and regretting my life choices. Now, let's float away from the fields and into the gardens. Because when bread wasn't enough, which it never was, people had to rely on vegetables. And if you think medieval diets were colorful and exciting, think again. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no peppers. Those didn't arrive in Europe until after Columbus did his whole oops, new continent thing. So what did they have? Leeks, cabbages, onions, more cabbages, turnips, and if you were lucky, peas. Basically, if it grew in damp dirt and didn't immediately die, they ate it. Gardens were tended by women and children who spent their days pulling weeds and praying rabbits didn't eat everything first. And storage? Oh yes, the glamorous root cellar. Imagine a dark, slightly damp hole in the ground filled with carrots, onions, and turnips. That was your winter survival kit. Yum. But wait. We're not done, because food collection wasn't just about plants. Oh no, enter dairy. Every morning, bright and early, cows had to be milked. This wasn't your modern push a button and walk away kind of thing. It was sitting on a wobbly stool, pulling at udders, hoping the cow didn't kick you in the head. The milk wasn't pasteurized, so let's just say it was rustic. Most of it was turned into butter and cheese, because those actually lasted longer than a day. Churning butter, that's where you spend 2 hours shaking a wooden barrel until you question your existence. Cheese making was equally thrilling. You pour the milk into vats, let it curdle, strain it through cloth, and then just wait for days, sometimes months. Cheese, in many ways, was medieval food insurance. Unless it went moldy, then it was just gross. Eggs also made an appearance, collected from chickens that roamed freely and probably stole more food than they produced. Eggs weren't eaten daily, though. They were saved for special days or used in fancy dishes for the wealthy. Which means if you were a peasant, you probably got eggs only when a chicken decided to be generous. Now, let's move into the fun stuff. And by fun, I mean not for peasants. Hunting was mostly reserved for the nobility. Lords loved chasing deer with packs of hounds, wearing ridiculous feathered hats, and pretending it was all very noble. Meanwhile, peasants were legally forbidden to hunt deer in many places. Why? Because venison was fancy meat, and heaven forbid the poor got protein. Peasants could also snare rabbits, hunt birds, and go fishing. Rivers and ponds were extremely important food sources. Fish could be salted, smoked, or pickled to last through the winter. And thanks to the Catholic Church declaring about 100 days of the year as no-meat days, fish was in high demand. That's right, medieval religion basically invented the pescatarian diet. Speaking of storage, let's talk about preserving food, because nothing says bedtime story like medieval methods of not starving. Salting was the big one. Meat and fish were rubbed with coarse salt and left to dry. The salt was expensive, but it worked. Smoking was another option. Hang your meat over a smoky fire and hope it didn't turn into charcoal. Drying beans, peas, and herbs was common too. Everything had to be stored in barrels, sacks, or jars, carefully sealed against mice. Spoiler, the mice usually won. Grain storage was especially crucial. A bad harvest meant famine, and famine meant, well, people eating bark and grass until they starved. The Middle Ages were fun like that. So villages built big communal barns, filled them with sacks of wheat, and guarded them like treasure. Because honestly, grain was treasure. Now, here's where things get weirdly fancy. Spices. Most peasants never even smelled a spice in their life. Their meals were salted if they were lucky. But for the wealthy, imported spices were all the rage. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, nutmeg, all shipped across continents at insane prices. You know how today people brag about their new iPhone? In medieval courts, people bragged about putting saffron in their porridge because nothing screams luxury like yellow oatmeal. Salt itself was a whole industry. Huge caravans carried it across Europe. Towns grew rich off the trade, and in many ways, it was the most important preservative of the Middle Ages. Forget gold, salt kept people alive. And so, that was the rhythm of medieval food collection. Fields, gardens, animals, rivers, cellars, a daily grind of picking, storing, preserving, and praying the harvest would be good enough to make it to spring. Was it thrilling? Not really. But for millions of medieval people, this was life. No feasts, no banquets, just endless repetition of the same chores year after year. And yet, strangely, there's something calming about it. Predictable, steady. Almost like the perfect bedtime story.
Welcome back, friends. If you're still awake after part one, well, congratulations. You must have a stronger attention span than the average medieval peasant had bread rations. But don't worry, we're about to get even more boring. Tonight, we're drifting further into the world of medieval food, which, spoiler alert, is mostly bread and more bread. And then, if you were lucky, some ale to wash it down. So, tuck yourself in, take a deep breath, and let's wander back to the muddy roads and smoky kitchens of the Middle Ages. Let's start with bread. Always bread. Medieval Europe was basically one long carb festival. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. In fact, if you asked the medieval peasant what they ate, the answer would be bread. If you asked them what their favorite food was, also bread. Now, not all bread was created equal. The rich had nice white bread made from wheat. Fluffy, soft, refined, the medieval equivalent of a brioche bun. The poor, they got something called maslin bread, which was basically a random mixture of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else hadn't gone moldy. It was dense, it was sour, it was chewy, and honestly, it probably doubled as a building material. Fun fact, bread was also used as a plate. They called it a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread slapped on the table, piled with stew, and then either eaten or tossed to the dogs after. Yes, in the Middle Ages, you could literally eat your plate. Eco-friendly, sure. Appetizing, debatable. And bread was baked maybe once a week, which means for most of the week, people were gnawing on bread that got progressively harder. By day 6, your dinner roll was basically a rock. Imagine soaking your food in ale just to chew it. Welcome to the 14th century. Ale, the medieval Gatorade. Speaking of ale, water was, not great. If you lived in a city, water probably had a little something extra in it. By something extra, I mean sewage. So instead, people drank ale. All day, every day, even children. Don't panic, it wasn't super strong. Small ale was low in alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria, not enough to get the whole village tipsy by noon. Brewing ale was another part of food collection. Barley had to be malted, mashed, boiled, fermented. Women, often called alewives, were the main brewers. Imagine spending your days stirring a bubbling vat of grain soup, waiting for it to turn into something drinkable. Riveting. For the wealthy, wine was also a thing. Imported from France if you could afford it. Spoiler, most couldn't. So for the average medieval peasant, it was ale, ale, and more ale. Breakfast, ale. Lunch, ale. Thirsty while plowing the field, ale. Honestly, medieval Europe was just one big, tipsy carb machine. Meat rare, but worth mentioning. Now, let's wander over to the meat situation. Spoiler, most peasants didn't get much. Maybe a bit of pork during a festival, maybe a rabbit if they caught one sneaking around. Otherwise, meat was expensive and usually eaten by the rich. The nobility, of course, went all out. Venison, boar, swan, peacock. Yes, they literally roasted peacocks and then redressed them in their feathers for decoration. Because nothing says I have too much money like eating a bird that tastes like chewy chicken and looks like a Las Vegas showgirl. For peasants, though, meat was often salted or smoked to last through the year. Bacon was a big deal. Not crispy breakfast bacon, but thick slabs of salted pork fat. A family with a pig had food security. A family without, well, they just got to smell their neighbor's dinner.
Seasonal eating, medieval style. One of the most important parts of medieval food collection was the seasons. Unlike us, with our grocery stores full of strawberries in January and avocados every day, medieval people had to live by the calendar. Spring meant greens, leeks, young onions, herbs. Summer brought berries, fresh vegetables, milk. Autumn was the big harvest grains, apples, nuts. And winter, well, winter was grim. That was when the root cellar became your best friend. Meals turned into endless stews of turnips, onions, and salted meat. If you didn't plan ahead, you didn't make it to spring. This cycle ruled everything. Feast days were often scheduled after harvests. Lent, that long period of fasting, was basically a clever way of stretching food supplies before Easter. Clever or depressing, depends on how you look at it. Peasant stew, the real national dish. Okay, so what did a typical peasant actually eat? The answer? Pottage, which is a fancy medieval way of saying throw whatever you have into a pot and boil it for hours. Pottage could be thick or thin, depending on how broke you were. It usually had grains like barley or oats, some beans or peas, maybe a cabbage or turnip, and if you were really lucky, a scrap of bacon. Think of it as the original stone soup. Every day, the pot stayed on the fire, and ingredients were just added in as they appeared. For the rich, pottage got an upgrade almond milk instead of water, spices like saffron or cinnamon, maybe some meat. But at the end of the day, rich or poor, everyone was eating some version of boiling mush. Delicious.
Welcome back, dreamers. If you've made it this far, then either you really love medieval food, or you're just too sleepy to change the video. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're gliding into the kitchens of the Middle Ages. Not the shiny, modern, stainless steel kind. No microwaves, no refrigerators. Just smoky rooms, wooden spoons, and a lot of guesswork. So, grab your imaginary wooden bowl, sit by the fire, and let's simmer slowly in another round of boring but cozy history. Kitchens. More smoke than fire. First things first, medieval kitchens weren't exactly pleasant places. Forget about extractor fans or clean tiles. These kitchens were basically large fireplaces with a few hooks and pots hanging above the flames. The air was thick with smoke, not in a cozy campfire way, but in a you're definitely developing lung problems kind of way. Chimneys weren't always a thing, so the smoke just drifted around until it found a way out, usually straight into someone's eyes. Cooking was done in iron pots, cauldrons, or on spits for roasting. Everything else? Boiled. You know that old joke about British food being bland? Yeah, that reputation has medieval roots. Most meals were some kind of boiling situation. Pottage, porridge, or stew, because boiling was easy, efficient, and you could just keep tossing stuff in. The tools of the trade. Now, let's take a sleepy tour of the kitchen tools. I know, exciting. Cauldrons. The medieval version of a slow cooker, except you had to hang it over an open fire and hope it didn't tip. Spits, long iron rods for roasting meat, usually turned by a servant or, in wealthier households, by a special contraption powered by dogs. Yes, some kitchens had turn-spit dogs, running on little treadmills to rotate the roast. PETA would not approve. Knives. Everyone had one, but forks? Rare. Forks were considered weird and unnecessary. People ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. Mortar and pestle, used for grinding grains, herbs, and the occasional questionable medieval medicine. Bread ovens, built of stone or clay, heated with wood fires. Baking was a communal event in many villages. Families brought their dough to the village oven, baked it, and hoped nobody stole their loaf. Butter, the eternal churn. Now let's talk about dairy again, because nothing screams bedtime story like butter. Butter making was the kind of task that seemed endless. You poured cream into a churn, then shook, pounded, or stirred it until it magically turned into butter. Hours of repetitive motion, squeaky wood, and sore arms. By the end, you had butter, and probably a deep hatred for butter making. But butter was important. It flavored bland food, preserved better than milk, and could even be used as medicine. Yes, medieval people believed butter had healing properties. Imagine going to a doctor and being told to rub butter on your problem. Charming. Cheese. Patience required. If butter was boring, cheese was downright glacial. The process started with curdling milk, usually with rennet, an enzyme from calf stomachs. Don't think too hard about that. Once the curds formed, they were drained, pressed, salted, and then left to age. Some cheeses were eaten fresh. Others sat around for months, growing flavors and occasionally fungi. Cheese was a staple for peasants and nobles alike. It traveled well, lasted long, and provided protein when meat was scarce. Imagine a medieval cellar filled with wheels of cheese, aging slowly in the cool dark. It sounds romantic, until you remember it also smelled like a foot wrapped in old hay. Storage. barrels, cellars, and hope. Food collection didn't end with gathering and cooking. Storage was half the battle. Without refrigeration, everything had to be preserved somehow. Grain, stored in sacks or bins, often in communal barns, constantly under threat from mice, damp, or just plain theft. Meat, salted, smoked, or dried, hung in rafters, kept in barrels, or buried in salt. Spoilage was common. Vegetables. Root crops like carrots and turnips were buried in sand or stored in cellars. Cabbages were sometimes pickled into sauerkraut because, yes, even in the Middle Ages, people were fermenting everything. Medieval pantries weren't cute little shelves of mason jars. They were dark, drafty rooms filled with barrels, baskets, and bags, and probably a mouse or two, or 10. Feasting versus fasting. One of the weird quirks of medieval food culture was the balance between feast and famine, or rather, feasting and fasting. The church had a huge say in what people ate. On fasting days, which were about a third of the year, meat was forbidden. That meant fish became the default protein. Wealthy households kept fish ponds for this reason. Ordinary people relied on rivers, lakes, or salted stockpiles. On the flip side, feast days were big events. People roasted entire animals, baked giant pies, and stuffed themselves silly. But the average daily diet, still bread, ale, and pottage. The contrast between feast days and regular days must have been wild. One day you're eating cabbage soup. The next day you're watching someone carry a roasted peacock into the hall like it's a trophy. The long wait for food. Here's a fun bedtime fact. Medieval cooking took forever. Boiling a pot of grains, hours. Baking bread, all day. Churning butter, endless. Nothing was instant. Even fast food was just bread and cheese you already had stored. And because cooking relied on wood fires, there was no turn up the heat option. Everything was slow, steady, and sometimes unpredictable, which is why so many medieval recipes read less like cook at 350 for 45 minutes and more like boil until it seems done. Very precise. Kitchens of the rich versus the poor. Let's not forget the great divide between rich and poor kitchens. A peasant's kitchen was basically a corner of their one-room house with a small hearth, a pot, and a spoon. That was it. Meals were simple, repetitive, and practical. A noble's kitchen, though, was a chaotic, smoky operation with dozens of servants, multiple fires, and enough pots and pans to supply a small army. Honestly, medieval noble kitchens were the original restaurant kitchens, just with fewer health codes and more rats. And food as status. And here's the thing, food wasn't just about survival. It was about showing status. What you ate and how it was served said a lot about your place in the medieval world. White bread for the rich, dark bread for the poor. Spices like cinnamon or saffron, luxury. A humble onion, peasant food. Even how you ate mattered. Nobles sat at tables with multiple courses. Peasants sat around a pot, dipping bread into stew. In some ways, not much has changed. People still use food to show off. Only instead of saffron porridge, now it's avocado toast on Instagram. And the monotony of it all. When we look back, it's easy to think of medieval food as quaint or charming. But let's be real. For most people, it was boring. Bread, pottage, ale, and repeat. Day after day, year after year. That monotony shaped the rhythm of life. And maybe that's the perfect note to end on tonight. Because monotony, when you think about it, is kind of soothing, predictable, like a bedtime story that just goes on and on. So, as you drift off, imagine the glow of a medieval fire, a pot of pottage bubbling slowly, a churn of butter squeaking in the corner, barrels of salted meat stacked against the wall, and a weary peasant chewing on yesterday's bread, already thinking about tomorrow's harvest. Not exciting, not dramatic, just endlessly, comfortingly boring.
Hey there, dreamers. Still with me? If so, impressive. We've covered fields, gardens, kitchens, and the eternal suffering of butter making. Tonight, we're wandering out of the smoky kitchen and into the bustling, but not too exciting, world of medieval markets and food trade. So, stretch out under your blanket, take a deep breath, and let's walk slowly through a medieval marketplace. Don't worry, nothing dramatic is going to happen. Just lots of vegetables, sacks of grain, and maybe a chicken or two. The village market, peasant supermarket. In most medieval villages, food wasn't bought in weekly grocery trips. It was gathered, grown, or bartered. But once or twice a week, a market might be held in the village square. Think of it as the original farmer's market, but with fewer mason jars and more mud. Stalls were wooden boards or just blankets laid on the ground. Sellers offered onions, leeks, turnips, beans, maybe a jug of ale. Chickens clucked, pigs squealed, and children ran around stealing apples when nobody was looking. It wasn't glamorous, but it was where people swapped their goods and gossiped about who was behind on their tithes. Coins existed, sure, but bartering was common. You give me eggs, I give you onions. You lend me your plow, I'll share my barley. The economy wasn't exactly Wall Street. It was more like one long group project where everyone tried not to starve. Town markets, the big upgrade. Now, if you were lucky enough to live near a town, things got a little more exciting. Town markets were larger, with more stalls, more goods, and more smells. Picture long rows of merchants selling everything from bread to fish to dubious-looking cheese. Fishmongers shouting about their catch of the day, probably herring. Bakers selling fresh loaves. Spice sellers carefully measuring out tiny amounts of pepper like it was powdered gold. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, all exotic, all pricey. Spices traveled along long trade routes from India and the Middle East across the Mediterranean, through Venice, and up into Europe. Every step of the journey added more to the price. By the time it reached your medieval table, a pinch of cinnamon was worth bragging about. In fact, spices were so valuable, they were sometimes kept under lock and key. Imagine needing a key to access your kitchen spice rack. That was medieval life for you. Salt, the real MVP. While spices were fancy, salt was essential. It wasn't just for flavor. It was for survival. Meat and fish had to be salted to last. Without salt, winter was a death sentence. Salt came from coastal evaporation ponds or inland salt mines. Entire towns grew rich off salt. Salzburg in Austria literally means salt fortress. The stuff was currency. Transporting it was slow, expensive, and vital. Caravans of carts trundled across Europe, guarded carefully. Because stealing salt wasn't just theft, it was practically sabotage. The fish economy. Thanks to the church's fasting rules, fish was a massive part of medieval trade. Herring and cod were especially important. Salted, smoked, and shipped in barrels, they fed entire countries. Northern Europe basically ran on herring. The Baltic Sea supplied so much of it that towns grew wealthy just from fishing and trade. Cod, caught off the North Atlantic, also became a staple. These fish were the medieval equivalent of instant noodles, cheap, filling, and everywhere. So, when you think medieval diet, don't just think bread and ale. Think bread, ale, and salted fish. Lots and lots of salted fish. Roads, carts, and slowness. Of course, all this trade depended on transportation, which in the Middle Ages was slow. Roads were muddy tracks full of potholes and bandits. Carts creaked along, pulled by oxen or horses. A journey of 50 miles could take several days. So if you were waiting on that shipment of saffron, good luck. It might arrive in a week or a month or never. Waterways were more reliable. Rivers and seas carried bulk goods like grain, salt, and fish. Boats could handle bigger loads and were faster than ox carts. Towns near rivers or coasts had a major advantage in the food trade. But for inland villages, most food never traveled far. What you grew, you ate. What you didn't grow, you probably never saw. Guilds and regulation. As towns grew, so did regulation. Guilds controlled trades: bakers, butchers, brewers. Each guild had rules. Bread had to be a certain weight. Ale had to be a certain strength. Prices were often fixed by law. In theory, this kept food fair and safe. In reality, people still cheated. Bakers might hollow out loaves. Brewers might water down ale. And if you got caught, punishments could be harsh: fines, loss of license, or even the pillory. Imagine standing in public while people threw old bread at you for baking bad bread. Medieval Yelp reviews were brutal. Food as power. At the end of the day, food collection and trade weren't just about survival. They were about control. Lords controlled landed harvest. Kings taxed salt and grain. The church dictated fasting days. Whoever controlled food controlled people. And peasants? They just kept planting, harvesting, and praying for rain, or for less rain, or for literally anything but famine. The slow, predictable rhythm. So there you have it. Medieval markets and trade. Not glamorous, not fast, just a slow shuffle of goods from hand to hand, sack to sack, barrel to barrel. Predictable, repetitive, and oddly comforting. As you drift off tonight, imagine walking through a medieval market. The cluck of chickens, the creak of carts, the murmur of voices, the smell of bread, fish, and too many unwashed bodies, and the steady rhythm of life repeating week after week, century after century. Not thrilling, not shocking, just endlessly boring. Which for a bedtime story is kind of perfect. Welcome back, traveler. If you're somehow still awake, congratulations. You've survived the butter churning, the onion picking, and the thrilling saga of salted herring. Tonight, we're stepping into the dimly lit halls of medieval castles, where the rich feasted like there was no tomorrow, while the peasants, of course, stuck with their usual diet of bread, porridge, and more bread. So tuck in, not too tightly, and let's stroll slowly, very slowly, through the world of medieval banquets versus peasant meals. Feasting like a lord. First, picture a medieval noble's great hall. Torches flicker on the walls. A long wooden table stretches across the room. At the top sits the lord or king, probably wearing something uncomfortable but expensive. When nobles feasted, they didn't hold back. We're talking entire roasted animals, boars, deer, swans, even peacocks. Yes, peacocks. Apparently, nothing said I'm rich and slightly unhinged like serving a bird with bright feathers that were plucked, roasted, and then carefully sewn back onto the body for display. Delicious and terrifying all at once. Servants carried in course after course. Meat ties, roasted venison, platters of fish, drowned in spices, exotic fruits if the Lord had connections, all washed down with endless jugs of wine and ale. Moderation? Never heard of it. The order of courses. Banquets followed a set order. First came light dishes, bread, soups, maybe some small meats. Then the heavy stuff rolled in. Roasted oxen, stuffed geese, whole pigs with apples in their mouths. Finally, desserts, tarts, custards, candied fruits. The sheer amount of food was overwhelming. Nobles weren't eating for hunger. They were eating to show off, to prove that they could afford cinnamon, sugar, or even almonds, to prove that their pigs were fatter than yours. It was basically medieval Instagram, but with more grease and less good lighting. Entertainment while you eat. Of course, a banquet wasn't just about food. It was about spectacle. While nobles picked at their peacock legs, minstrels played lutes, jugglers tossed knives, dwarves, jesters, and even performing bears sometimes made appearances, because nothing says bon appetit like a bear on a chain. Between courses, people told stories, recited poems, or debated politics. It was noisy, chaotic, and definitely not the place for a calm bedtime snack. The spice flex. Remember those spices we talked about earlier? At feasts, nobles dumped them on everything. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron. If it was expensive, it went in the pot. Not because it made food taste better, though it helped cover the "is this meat slightly spoiled" problem, but because it showed wealth. Imagine tossing handfuls of cinnamon on your chicken just to prove you had money. That was medieval elite dining. Flavor was nice, but bragging rights were the main course. Table manners. Sort of. Now, before you picture elegant nobles delicately sipping wine, let's set the record straight. Table manners weren't exactly refined. Forks weren't common yet. People ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. Trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, doubled as plates. You piled food on your bread, soaked up the grease, and eventually tossed the soggy remains to dogs or servants. Napkins, sometimes a tablecloth, sometimes your sleeve, sometimes nothing at all. So yes, banquets were grand, but they were also sticky, greasy, and a bit of a mess. The other side, peasant monotony. Meanwhile, back in the village, the peasants' diet was less exciting. Actually, let's be honest, it was soul-crushingly repetitive. Breakfast, porridge. Lunch, bread and ale. Dinner, more bread, maybe with some peas or beans thrown in if you were lucky. Meat was rare, maybe a scrap of bacon or salted pork on holidays. Dairy was more common. Cheese, butter, milk, but only in moderation. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and turnips filled most meals. Fruits when they were in season. Otherwise, porridge, bread, and ale. Over and over and over. If nobles were eating peacocks with cinnamon, peasants were eating boiled cabbage with a sigh. Feast days for peasants. The one bright spot for peasants was feast days. On religious holidays, lords sometimes provided food for tenants. Extra bread, meat, or ale might be distributed at the manor. For peasants, this was a rare chance to taste something richer than their daily gruel. Weddings, festivals, or harvest celebrations also meant slightly better food. A shared pig, fresh beer, maybe a pie. But these moments were rare. 90% of the time, it was the same old bread and beans. Banquet waste versus peasant hunger. The contrast was stark. Nobles stuffed themselves at banquets, sometimes leaving half the food untouched. Leftovers might be given to servants or the poor, but only after sitting out all day. Meanwhile, peasants struggled to make their grain last through the winter. Bad harvest, they went hungry. Famine year, things got desperate. The divide between noble tables and peasant bowls was a daily reminder of medieval inequality. You could be starving in your cottage while your lord was tossing cinnamon on his roasted swan. Comforting thought, isn't it? Symbolism of food. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was status. A banquet said, "I am powerful, wealthy, and blessed by God." A peasant's meal said, "I hope it rains just enough this year, but not too much." Bread itself reflected status. White bread, made from fine wheat flour, was for nobles. Darker, coarser bread was for peasants. The whiter your loaf, the higher your place on the social ladder. Which is ironic because today, whole grain is more expensive. Falling asleep at the feast. So as you drift off, imagine the echoing hall of a noble's banquet, the clatter of knives, the laughter of lords, the endless stream of roasted meats. Now imagine just a few miles away, a peasant family quietly eating their bowl of thin stew. The contrast was stark, but the rhythm was the same. Day after day, meal after meal, whether you were drowning in spices or nibbling cabbage. Food was life, and food was status. And so, in the grand tapestry of medieval food collection, banquets and bread bowls stitched together a story of extravagance and monotony. Neither very exciting, both strangely soothing. Perfect for lulling you into a gentle sleep.